December 15th, 1944. Captain Takeshi Yamamoto of the Imperial Japanese Navy stood in the pre-dawn darkness of a holding facility in San Diego, California, his uniform torn and salt-stained from 3 weeks adrift in the Pacific after his destroyer was defeated in the waters near Leyte Gulf. He had prepared himself for execution, for torture, for the brutal treatment that military doctrine had promised, awaited all prisoners who fell into enemy hands. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Captain Yamamoto and his fellow prisoners were about to witness would shatter every certainty they had carried into the conflict, transforming their understanding not just of their enemy, but of the very nature of the struggle they had believed they were fighting. Yamamoto had entered military service in 1936, ascending through the ranks during the expansion across the Pacific. He had been taught that America was a nation of weakness and decadence, a country that could not sustain prolonged hardship, where citizens lived in spiritual poverty despite material abundance. His instructors at the Naval Academy had explained that American fighting spirit would crumble under pressure, that their industrial capacity was exaggerated propaganda, and that victory was inevitable for a people unified in purpose and willing to sacrifice everything. These lessons had been reinforced through 8 years of service, through every briefing, every strategic discussion, every propaganda broadcast heard aboard ship. The reality he encountered in American captivity began dismantling these beliefs from the first morning. Lieutenant Kenji Sato, who had served as Yamamoto's communications officer, later wrote in a diary that would be preserved in the National Archives. The guards brought breakfast before sunrise. I expected scraps, perhaps spoiled rice, the minimum to keep us alive for interrogation. Instead, they carried metal trays with portions larger than what I had eaten as a free man in the final year before capture. Scrambled eggs, not 1 but 3 with bread, butter, jam and coffee with real sugar and cream. I thought this was a trick, a single generous meal before deprivation began. I was wrong. The food continued. 3 meals daily, each with more calories than Yamamoto had consumed in any single day during the final 6 months of active service. Fresh fruit appeared regularly, oranges from California groves, apples from Washington orchards, bananas shipped from South American suppliers. The bread was soft white, made from wheat flour that had become increasingly rare aboard Japanese vessels as the conflict progressed. There was meat at dinner, sometimes beef, sometimes pork, portions that would have fed 3 sailors aboard Yamamoto's destroyer. Warrant Officer Hiroshi Tanaka, a veteran of 12 years' service, found the abundance psychologically destabilizing. He confided to Yamamoto during evening recreation time in the prison yard, "If this is how they feed prisoners, how do they feed their own people? How do they feed their military? We were told America was struggling, rationing, barely maintaining supply lines, but they give us more food as captives than I received as a warrant officer on active duty." The prisoners tried to rationalize what they experienced. Perhaps this facility was exceptional, designed to soften prisoners for interrogation. Perhaps the abundance was temporary, a brief period of plenty before harsher conditions. Perhaps this was all theater, staged to create false impressions. These explanations became harder to maintain as weeks became months, and the food never diminished in quality or quantity. In February of 1945, the administration announced that a group of prisoners would be transported to a work detail at a farm in California's Central Valley. Yamamoto was among the 23 men selected. They traveled by truck, accompanied by 6 guards, along highways that themselves challenged everything they had been taught. The roads were paved, smooth, maintained, stretching for hundreds of miles without significant damage, despite years of conflict. They passed through small towns that showed no evidence of hardship, homes with painted exteriors, churches with intact steeples, shops with windows full of goods. The farm where they were stationed belonged to the Morrison family, who had lost one son at Normandy and had another serving in the Pacific Fleet. Robert Morrison, the father, was 58 years old, his face weathered from decades of agricultural work under California sun. He greeted the prisoners with cautious reserve, but without hostility, explaining through a translator that they would be helping with the harvest of produce destined for both civilian markets and military supply chains. The work was hard, but not brutal. The prisoners worked 8-hour days, 5 days weekly, with breaks for water and lunch. They were paid a small wage in scrip that could be used at the camp commissary. The physical labor was familiar to many of them, particularly those from rural backgrounds. But the scale of the operation was staggering. The Morrison farm covered 300 acres, with mechanized equipment that could accomplish in hours what would have taken days with manual labor alone. It was Corporal Masaru Ito, the youngest of the group at 22 years, who first noticed the waste. After a morning of harvesting tomatoes, he saw Morrison instructing workers to leave behind fruit that was slightly overripe or cosmetically imperfect. Through the translator, Ito asked why perfectly edible produce was being abandoned in the field. Morrison explained that the market demanded certain standards of appearance and that the cost of transporting and sorting marginally acceptable produce exceeded its value. The discarded tomatoes, he noted, would be plowed back into the soil as fertilizer for next season's crop. That evening, Ito spoke to his fellow prisoners with barely contained emotion. "They throw away more food in a single morning than my family would eat in a week. They plow back into the earth vegetables that we would consider treasure. And this is not a special farm, not a showcase. Morrison says there are thousands like his across California alone, tens of thousands across the entire country." The psychological impact deepened in March when Morrison arranged for a supervised trip to the nearby town of Fresno. The stated purpose was to purchase specific supplies for the farm, but Morrison, who had spoken with the camp administrator, understood that allowing the prisoners to witness ordinary American life might accomplish more than any propaganda could achieve. 16 prisoners, including Yamamoto, made the journey, accompanied by 4 guards and Morrison himself. The main street of Fresno was not particularly impressive by American standards, a modest downtown serving a regional agricultural community. But to men who had spent years in an empire under increasing strain, it represented something nearly incomprehensible. The shops were open, stocked, functioning normally. A hardware store displayed shelves full of tools, equipment, supplies in quantities that would have required special authorization and extensive paperwork in Japan. A clothing store showed racks of garments in various sizes, available for immediate purchase without rationing coupons. Then Morrison led them to the supermarket. The building occupied nearly an entire city block, its windows bright with afternoon sun reflecting off polished glass. Morrison held the door open, and the prisoners entered into a space that seemed designed to overwhelm the senses. The air was cool, maintained by refrigeration systems that kept the entire building at a comfortable temperature. The lighting was bright, revealing every detail of the merchandise displayed in long aisles that stretched from the front entrance to distant back walls. Yamamoto stopped 3 steps inside the entrance, his breath caught in his throat. Directly ahead stood pyramids of fresh fruit, apples, oranges, grapes, pears, each variety sorted by grade and quality, each piece individually selected for appearance. The abundance was not military, not industrial, but casual, decorative, designed purely to attract customers through visual appeal. To the left stood vegetables, more varieties than Yamamoto could immediately identify, each type available in multiple grades and preparations. Lieutenant Sato moved toward the canned goods aisle, his hands trembling slightly as he examined the shelves. There were dozens of varieties of canned vegetables, fruits, meats, soups, each brand competing with others in packaging and price. The quantity in this single aisle, he later wrote, exceeded the entire food supply aboard our destroyer during the final months of operation. And this was one aisle among many, in one store among thousands, in one town among tens of thousands. The meat counter stretched for 40 feet along the back wall, refrigerated cases displaying beef, pork, lamb, chicken, each cut precisely prepared and labeled with price per pound. The variety was staggering, different cuts for different purposes, different grades for different budgets, all available simultaneously to anyone with money to purchase them. A butcher stood behind the counter, white apron clean, ready to cut custom orders to customer specifications. Corporal Ito found himself in the dairy section, staring at shelves of milk, cream, butter, cheese, yogurt, each product available in multiple brands and varieties. He reached out to touch a bottle of milk, half expecting it to vanish like a mirage, but the glass was cold and solid under his fingers. The label indicated it had been bottled 2 days earlier at a local dairy. The date was printed clearly, along with a guarantee of freshness and quality. Morrison watched the prisoners move through the store, their faces reflecting confusion, wonder, and growing comprehension. He spoke quietly to the translator. "Tell them this is not special. Tell them this is ordinary. There are bigger stores in larger cities, smaller stores in smaller towns, but this is normal for America. This is how our people live during the conflict." Warrant Officer Tanaka stood in the center of the main aisle, slowly turning to take in the entire space. He had studied American industrial capacity before the conflict began, had reviewed intelligence estimates of production capabilities, but those had been abstract numbers on paper. This was concrete, immediate, undeniable. The sheer casualness of the abundance communicated something that statistics could not, that this level of production was not strained, not exceptional, but routine. The bakery section displayed dozens of varieties of bread, rolls, cakes, pastries, all baked that morning on site. The coffee aisle offered multiple brands, roasted and ground, from suppliers in South America and Africa, shipped across oceans despite the ongoing conflict. The cereal aisle contained colorful boxes designed to attract children, sweetened products designed purely for pleasure rather than nutrition. Yamamoto found himself examining labels, reading descriptions, trying to understand the logistics that made such abundance possible. A can of pineapple from Hawaii, processed and shipped despite the strategic importance of those islands. A bottle of olive oil from California, a luxury item made available to ordinary consumers. A package of cookies from a bakery in Chicago, transported thousands of miles to reach this store in Central California. The prisoners spent nearly an hour in the store, Morrison allowing them to explore freely, while guards maintained discreet distance. Some examined products they recognized, comparing quality and variety to what had been available in Japan. Others focused on completely unfamiliar items, trying to understand their purpose and use. All of them struggled to reconcile what they saw with what they had been taught. The translator approached Yamamoto near the end of the visit. "Morrison asks if you understand what this means. He says this store, this ordinary store, represents the true nature of the conflict. He says Japan challenged a nation that could feed its prisoners better than its own military fed its officers, a nation that could maintain such abundance in ordinary towns, while simultaneously producing thousands of aircraft, hundreds of ships, millions of tons of supplies for forces fighting across 2 oceans and multiple continents." The journey back to the farm occurred in silence. The prisoners sat in the truck bed, watching the California landscape pass, each man absorbed in his own thoughts. The physical evidence they had witnessed could not be dismissed or explained away. This was not propaganda, not deception, but simple reality. America possessed resources on a scale that made continued resistance not just difficult, but ultimately meaningless. That evening, Yamamoto requested a meeting with Lieutenant Commander James Patterson, the camp administrator. Patterson, a 34-year-old officer who had served in the Pacific before being assigned to prisoner administration, received Yamamoto in his office. Through the translator, Yamamoto spoke carefully. "I wish to understand something. Everything we were taught about America suggested you were weak, decadent, unable to sustain hardship. But what I have seen suggests the opposite, that your nation's strength comes precisely from the prosperity you have built. Can you explain this paradox?" Patterson considered his response carefully before speaking. "Captain, I think your leaders confused comfort with weakness. They assumed that people who lived well could not fight well, that prosperity made us soft. But they misunderstood what prosperity represents. It is not softness but surplus, surplus production, surplus resources, surplus capacity. When the conflict began, we had that surplus to draw upon. We could expand production without causing civilian hardship because we were not operating at maximum capacity, even during peace. What you saw today in that store, that is normal life for Americans during the conflict. Now imagine what we can produce when we apply that same system to military purposes? The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, ranging across topics of industrial organization, agricultural production, educational systems, and social structure. Patterson brought out maps, charts, production statistics, not classified materials, but publicly available information that illustrated the scale of American capacity. The numbers were staggering: annual steel production exceeding 80 million tons, aircraft production approaching 100,000 units yearly, shipbuilding capacity that could produce cargo vessels faster than they could be sent to the bottom of the ocean. Yamamoto listened, questioned, calculated, and ultimately understood. The conflict had never been sustainable. The initial victories had been possible only because American forces were initially unprepared, but once the industrial machinery engaged, the outcome was mathematically certain. Every month the conflict continued. The disparity in available resources grew larger. Japan had been fighting not just American military forces, but an entire continental economy that could simultaneously wage a global conflict and maintain civilian prosperity. In the months that followed, word of the supermarket visit spread through the prisoner population. Men who had not witnessed it firsthand heard detailed descriptions from those who had. Some refused to believe the accounts, insisting they must be exaggerated or staged, but most recognized the truth in what was described, particularly as similar observations accumulated from other prisoner groups taken on other supervised excursions. Lieutenant Sato wrote in his diary, "I believed I was fighting for a great cause, for the prosperity and security of our nation. But I see now that we challenged a country whose ordinary citizens lived with abundance we could scarcely imagine. We thought their prosperity was weakness, but it was the foundation of their strength. A nation that feeds its prisoners, as America feeds us, cannot be defeated through force of will alone. The material disparity is too vast." The psychological transformation was not uniform or immediate. Some prisoners clung to their previous beliefs, interpreting the abundance as temporary or somehow false. Others became deeply depressed, struggling with the realization that the sacrifices they had made, the comrades they had lost, had been in service of an impossible objective. But many, including Yamamoto, moved toward a new understanding, that the conflict's outcome had been determined not by courage or spirit, but by fundamental economic realities that no amount of determination could overcome. In August of 1945, news reached the camp that the conflict had ended. The circumstances of that ending, the deployment of atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, added another dimension to the prisoners' understanding. America had not merely outproduced Japan, but had simultaneously developed weapons technology that represented an entirely different order of capability. The Manhattan Project had consumed resources equivalent to the cost of several aircraft carriers, yet had been pursued as one project among thousands, a single strand in an enormous web of research, development, and production. The weeks following the end of the conflict brought additional revelations. American officials organized educational sessions for prisoners awaiting repatriation, sessions that provided context for what they had witnessed. A civilian economist from the University of California visited the camp in late September, delivering a lecture on American agricultural and industrial production that filled in gaps the prisoners had not even known existed. The economist, Professor William Henderson, explained the interconnected systems that made the supermarket possible. He described the railroad network spanning the continent, over 200,000 miles of track connecting farms to processing facilities to distribution centers to retail stores. He outlined the trucking industry that supplemented rail transport, the refrigeration technology that preserved perishables during transit, the packaging innovations that protected products and extended shelf life. Henderson brought charts showing agricultural output figures that seemed almost fantastical. Wheat production exceeding 1 billion bushels annually, corn production approaching 3 billion bushels, cattle herds numbering over 70 million head, cotton harvests measured in millions of bales. And critically, he emphasized, this production occurred while millions of American men served in military forces overseas, their agricultural labor replaced by mechanization and the expanded participation of women in the workforce. The professor also addressed the industrial side of the equation. He explained that American factories had converted from civilian to military production with remarkable speed after the conflict began, but that this conversion had not required abandoning civilian production entirely. The economy was large enough, diverse enough, productive enough to sustain both military and civilian needs simultaneously. Automobile factories that had produced 4 million civilian vehicles annually in 1941 had shifted to military production, yet the existing stock of civilian vehicles was sufficient to maintain transportation networks throughout the conflict. Yamamoto listened to these lectures with the intensity of a student preparing for examinations. He took notes, asked questions, sought to understand not just what America had done, but how such achievement was possible. The answers invariably led back to interconnected factors: natural resources, technological development, educational systems, capital investment, organizational efficiency, and perhaps most importantly, the long period of peace and stability that had allowed these systems to mature before the conflict began. One evening during a discussion session following Henderson's lecture, Corporal Ito posed a question that had troubled many of the prisoners. If American capacity was so vast, why had the initial phase of the conflict gone so favorably for Japan? Why had American forces seemed unprepared if the underlying strength was so immense? Henderson responded thoughtfully. America was unprepared for conflict, not because we lacked capacity, but because we lacked readiness. We had minimized military spending during the years of peace, maintained small standing forces, prioritized civilian prosperity over military preparation. When the conflict began, we needed time to convert our economic capacity into military capability. That conversion took months, sometimes years for complex weapons systems. But once it was complete, the sheer scale of our productive capacity determined the outcome. Japan achieved early successes against an unprepared opponent, but faced inevitable defeat once American industry fully engaged. The repatriation process began in late October. Yamamoto and his fellow prisoners boarded ships for the journey home, carrying with them not just memories, but fundamentally altered worldviews. The voyage across the Pacific took 2 weeks, giving them time to absorb what they had learned, to discuss among themselves what their experiences meant for Japan's future. Lieutenant Sato organized informal discussion groups among the returning prisoners, evening gatherings where men shared observations and struggled to understand the implications. Some remained bitter, feeling they had been deceived by leaders who had promised victory while concealing the true disparity in capabilities. Others focused on practical lessons, discussing how Japanese agriculture and industry might adopt American methods. A few became philosophical, wondering whether Japan's traditional emphasis on spiritual strength over material prosperity had been fundamentally misguided. Yamamoto participated in these discussions, but also spent hours alone at the ship's railing, watching the Pacific waters and remembering. He thought about the destroyer he had commanded, the crew members lost when the vessel went down, the comrades who had perished believing they fought for a righteous and achievable cause. The supermarket in Fresno had revealed to him that those deaths had been in service of an impossible objective, a truth that was difficult to carry. They returned to a Japan devastated by years of conflict, cities destroyed, infrastructure collapsed, populations struggling with basic survival. The contrast with California's abundance could not have been more stark. Tokyo, once a metropolis of millions, lay in ruins, with large sections reduced to ash and rubble. The rail system that had once connected the nation operated sporadically, with damaged tracks and destroyed bridges limiting service. Food rationing continued, with civilians receiving allocations that would have seemed inadequate even by the austere standards of military service during the final months of the conflict. Yamamoto's family had survived, though their home in Yokohama had been completely destroyed. His wife and 2 daughters had relocated to relatives in a rural area, living in conditions that would have been considered impoverished even before the conflict began. When he reunited with them in early November of 1945, the joy of survival was tempered by the harsh reality of their circumstances. They lived in a single room of a farmhouse, sleeping on thin mats, eating rice and vegetables when available, wearing patched clothing that had been mended repeatedly. His wife, Keiko, had aged visibly during his 3 years away, her face lined with stress and privation. His daughters, 10 and 7 when he had last seen them, were now 13 and 10, thin and quiet, their childhood compressed by hardship. That first evening, as they sat together eating a modest dinner of rice and pickled vegetables, Yamamoto struggled to reconcile the reality before him with the abundance he had witnessed in America. His younger daughter, Yuki, asked him what America had been like. He paused, uncertain how to answer, how to explain to a child who had known nothing but scarcity that their enemies lived with casual abundance. Finally, he told her simply, "It was different, very different. Perhaps someday you will have the opportunity to see for yourself." In the months that followed, Yamamoto began working with agricultural cooperatives, applying knowledge gained from his time at the Morrison farm. He advocated for mechanization, for improved fertilizer use, for better distribution systems. Progress was slow, hindered by lack of capital, damaged infrastructure, and the overwhelming challenge of basic survival. But gradually, incrementally, improvements emerged. In the decades that followed, many of these former prisoners contributed to Japan's reconstruction and economic development. Yamamoto became involved in agricultural modernization, applying lessons learned from the Morrison farm to improve Japanese farming efficiency. Lieutenant Sato worked in education, teaching younger generations about the importance of accurate information and realistic assessment of capabilities. Warrant Officer Tanaka joined a trading company, helping to rebuild commercial relationships with former adversaries. They spoke rarely of their experience in the supermarket, partly because it seemed too trivial compared to the larger tragedy of the conflict, partly because it was difficult to convey the psychological impact of that moment. How could one explain that seeing abundance of canned fruit communicated strategic reality more effectively than any battle report? How could one describe the specific feeling of understanding, in a single instant, that everything one had believed about the conflict was fundamentally mistaken, but among themselves, in private conversations and occasional reunions, they remembered. They remembered the cool air inside the store, the bright lights reflecting off polished floors, the pyramids of fresh fruit, the endless aisles of products. They remembered the casual way Morrison had escorted them through that space, the matter-of-fact explanation that this was normal, ordinary, unremarkable for America. And they remembered the moment when belief gave way to understanding, when ideology confronted reality, when the true nature of the conflict became undeniable. The supermarket in Fresno closed in the 1970s, replaced by a larger facility on the edge of town. The building was converted to other uses, then eventually demolished. No plaque marks the location. No memorial commemorates what occurred there. But in the broader sweep of history, that ordinary building served as the site of an important transformation, the moment when men who had fought against America began to understand why they had never had any realistic chance of prevailing, and why that outcome had been determined not on battlefields, but in the farms, factories, and supermarkets of a continental nation whose prosperity was both the cause and the expression of its power. Yamamoto lived until 2003, dying at the age of 88 in Tokyo. His daughter, while sorting through his papers after his passing, found a photograph he had kept for nearly 60 years, a picture taken during his time as a prisoner, showing him standing with other prisoners outside the Morrison farm. On the back, in his careful handwriting, was a single sentence: "The day I began to understand." She never learned what specific understanding he referred to, but she preserved the photograph and the note, recognizing that they held significance she could not fully grasp. The story of what Japanese prisoners witnessed in American supermarkets was not widely publicized during the conflict or in its immediate aftermath. It seemed too small, too mundane, compared to the grand narratives of military campaigns and political decisions. But for the men who experienced it, the supermarket represented something profound, a moment when the propaganda they had been fed gave way to observable reality, when ideological certainty confronted empirical evidence, when the true nature of modern conflict revealed itself not through weapons and battles, but through the ordinary abundance of civilian life. The lesson was clear to those who learned it. Military capability in modern industrial conflict flows directly from economic capacity, and economic capacity manifests in the daily lives of ordinary citizens. A nation that could maintain such prosperity while simultaneously waging a global conflict possessed resources that could not be overcome through spirit or determination alone. The prisoners who understood this carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives, a hard-won wisdom gained through the collapse of comfortable illusions. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.